Hello, everybody. It's Larry Johnson, founder of the Eight Principles, and your host for Eight Principles Voices. And I'm delighted to have with me a man that I'm anxious to get to know more about. He runs a nonprofit association. What's that all about? But he didn't start out doing that. He's a fighting Irish. There's more to hear about that. But also, he moved from the upper Midwest to Idaho. Think about that. Of course, I like Idaho, but that's a different story. Kevin Bailey is the executive director of the Idaho Nonprofit Center, not association, but it is an association. So, welcome, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, I kind of gave people a little idea of who you are. Tell us a little bit more. What you study in school? Why are you doing what you're doing? I always ask people that.
It hasn't been a straightforward journey for sure. It's not an A to B line. There's no real, I often tell people like there's not a real career path that's obvious, especially for myself, but a lot of folks that end up in the nonprofit sector, sometimes it's by accident, sometimes it's because they have a passion, right? But oftentimes, I feel like people are deterred from going into the sector because it's seen as, something where you can't make a living or there's a perception that it's just a volunteer environment. But how I ended up here, it started for me, I think, probably early on in my high school days doing like Habitat for Humanity work. We took some summer mission trips at in our church. We'd go to Appalachia. I grew up in the Minneapolis area, so we drove a couple of vans down to Appalachia, built a house for a week, and there's something about giving back to the community and really at that point understanding poverty and real human needs that struck a chord with me. And when I went to college, I went to University of Notre Dame and had an opportunity to continue that work. They had a center on campus called the Center for Social Concerns, which really was a formative place for me during my college years. And part of the reason I jumped into nonprofit work was because of that center, and both in the community locally in South Bend, but I also had the opportunity to travel internationally through that work throughout my college years. So I ended up going to Uganda for actually twice during my undergraduate years, once for a research project, and then again for a summer teaching experience with the Holy Cross Order. For those that might be familiar, they're the order that runs University of Notre Dame. So I worked in a school, had no real qualifications. Like it was really more of an experience for me than it was for the students, to be honest. But so I got way more out of it than probably anybody else in Uganda did. But that really, it struck a passion for me for international work, which ended up being my first nonprofit job post college. And can get into that later. But that's kind of where it all started. It started for me in school as an undergraduate, and I've just continued to really. I think one of the guiding principles in my life for how I make decisions and what I do is, how can I leave a legacy that leaves the community, leaves the world in a better place than I found it, and how can I do work that's meaningful, that's not just creating widgets, it's not just for the purpose of making money, but it's leaving like a lasting impact in the community.
I was when you said I think that your trip to Uganda was more meaningful to you than the Ugandans. When I was in school, I did some summer mission work as well, and I they sent me to the outer wilds of West Virginia. There's an interesting place for you, and some of the the coal fields, those areas, and it's like well, let's just don't do too much damage while you're there, and it does, but it prepares you because it gives you another world experience that is so different from your own, so fundamentally different. And I think we're both pretty sheltered middle class boys in many ways, and so when you go into a situation like that, you realize how singular your own experience really is and how big the world is. And I think the goal is just don't do too much damage, don't come back in jail or something else. Let's get through this pretty good. So but God can prepare you in a situation like that, and if you're open and you're willing. So what was your first nonprofit job? I mean, real job, meaning it was a paid job that you were doing as a day job.
Yeah, so this is where the Uganda story comes in. So, on one of those trips as an undergraduate, I was on the airplane. The way that you get to Uganda at that time, and probably still right now, is we'd fly out of Chicago because it was the closest big airport to South Bend, fly to London or Amsterdam, and then down to Entebbe, Uganda, where the airport is. And so you got two flights. It takes basically 2 full days. You're totally wrecked when you get there because you haven't slept in it seems like 48 hours. But on one of those trips, I was on the second leg, so coming from London on somewhere over the Sahara Desert on my way to Uganda, and I was wearing a Notre Dame sweatshirt on the airplane. I go to the back of the plane, stand in line for the bathroom. This guy who was older than me, asked me if was a Notre Dame student because I was wearing a Notre Dame sweatshirt. And his name was Gus, and he actually was a resident of South Bend, and he was headed to Uganda as well to
Whoa.
yeah, to help get he was Notre Dame grad 1980, class of 1980. I was class of 2008. So we had the numbers in reverse order there and immediately struck it off. We got in a conversation, probably 10-15 minute conversation, exchanged contact information, just standing in line for the bathroom. And he was headed to northern Uganda, which at the time, this was probably 2006, 2007. They were just coming off the tail end of a pretty violent, kind of very isolated civil war. There was about 2 million residents internally displaced in the country, living in essentially refugee camps in their own backyard. And the Lord's Resistance Army, which was this really brutal kind of child enslavement army led by a guy named Joseph Kony, and there was actually a documentary made about this called Invisible Children. And he had brutalized the region, and people were in these really isolated internally displaced person camps. Some of these camps were 100,000 people in 1 or 2 square miles. Obviously, like the UN and other international agencies were heavily involved in bringing food and water and shelter to those places. But he was headed there to start an organization that was going to work with the Archdiocese of Northern Uganda, the Catholic Archdiocese, to install solar powered computers. So this is about 2006, 2007. So they didn't really there was no electricity in this part of the country. People had cell phones at best, like little Nokia brick phones. At this time, there wasn't really any smartphones. You couldn't connect to the internet. So he had a technological solution that would put solar powered computers and this long range microwave Wi-Fi that would go from point to point, so you could connect some of the basic schools and health systems and aid offices, things like that. And they were just piloting this project. And he asked me on that airplane ride if I'd like to come over and see it. And I was curious. I was just about to be a senior in college, and I was like, of course, let me see if I can find time at the end of my teaching stint in southern Uganda and get up there. And so at that time, the university had put northern Uganda as a no travel zone. It was under a State Department warning, and so we would get in trouble if we traveled up north. It's about an 8-hour bus ride on terrible roads, but we decided to be rebels, and we did it anyways. And I went.
The natives were restless, is what you're telling me, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So we went up there, and I spent 2 or 3 days just getting a tour of what was going to go on, and kind of fell in love with the concept, and knew sort of at that point that I wanted to get back there after I graduated. I didn't know for sure how that was going to be possible, but I went back for my senior year of college. Was kind of debating like law school. I was debating going into a national teaching program. But I really kind of knew it in my heart of hearts. I wanted to get back and do international work. And I specifically thought I might have an opportunity to get back to Uganda. So we kept in touch and had lunch together a number of times in South Bend. And I asked him one day, could I work for you guys? And he's at this point had just deployed all this technical equipment. They hadn't really thought through a plan on like, how are we going to staff this? There wasn't any operating funds. So he said, we don't have a job for you, but if you want to raise your own salary, we'd love to have you. And you can be our first kind of managing director that's working with the Archdiocese over there to get this thing going. And I thought, okay, there's an opportunity. I thought about it for a second. I didn't have any fundraising experience. I thought about it for 24 hours and said, I'm going to ask my parents for their Christmas card contact list, 250, 300 people, sent one-page letters. This is before, any social media. This is really before like Kickstarter campaigns. And I just typed out a letter, slapped a picture of myself from the previous summer in Uganda, explained what I wanted to do, and sent it out. And we're talking like within 2 or 3 months, as my second semester, my senior year rolled on, yeah, $20,000 came in, then it was 30, then it was about 40,000 by the time we were done fundraising. and I had enough to stay for 2 years. You can live for a long time. Basically, my most expensive line item was international like rescue health insurance, just in case of an emergency. But my living expenses were super cheap, and I paid myself $500 a month, which was kind of a white collar salary in Uganda at the time. A $6,000 a year job was kind of what aid workers made over there. And so it ended up being a 2 year gig and really helping that organization get off the ground and establish local leadership. One of the things I was most proud of is after 2 years, we had funding from big international aid agencies and then an established staff of Ugandans and an executive director that was Ugandan. And my job was really, I felt like sort of internal consultant, getting things going. I had no idea what I was doing, but we figured it out along the way.
Well, Kevin, that says to me sometimes there are advantages to being young and stupid.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, mistakes were certainly made.
Well, I meant going up there in the beginning. That's young and stupid. We're just going to go anywhere. They tell me that the terrorists are just off the road, but nothing's going to happen. We're going to go, and it's going to happen.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I remember the first visit I went up there, which was just the 2 or 3 days to kind of see things. I had this like real sense of fear. At that point, no real violence had broken out in at least a year or two, but it was still so fresh in people's minds that you could like feel the
mhm.
post-war trauma in the people that we were talking to. And so I would like go to bed at night, those first few nights, thinking like, are the Lord's Resistance Army gonna come over the gate and attack this compound? And like, what do I do? Like, could this be, is this the stupidest thing I've ever done? And none of that happened. It was a completely safe
Well, when you said
experience.
you were going to Uganda and of course, you're flying into Entebbe. I'm a little older than you, and when I hear the word Entebbe, I think of the terrorists and the capture of the airplane and being held hostage, and then the Mossad going in and rescuing them. See, I think of Entebbe, I think of that. Um, so, were there any visions of that when you arrived at the airport?
Yeah, I mean that was well before my time, but I did see, the movie, and that was fun to kind of understand that history. And certainly that was something that was seared in the locals' memory as a really notable international event. But no, it wasn't something I had thought much about because it was so much before my time.
Well, I'll forgive you for calling me an old man, even just referring to that. Okay, Kevin. So that's your first experience, and you've sort of done a few things, but then suddenly you landed in a little town called Pocatello,
Mm-hmm.
eastern side of our state, Idaho. Uh, you know somebody there? You just decided you wanted to jump off the planet? What led you to Pocatello?
Yeah, well, I guess one of the common themes of my career is that I'm stupid enough to jump into things that have no real connection or precedent. And this Uganda story, similar to the Pocatello story in a way, like I didn't have necessarily a large reason or a connection to the community. It was sort of a coincidental stroke of luck. And so I was at the time living in Omaha, where my wife is from, and we had been there for 5 or 6 years. And I was working in nonprofits in Omaha, mostly in human services, working in sort of the education space as well as with immigrants to the community and community center type programs. And at that point, I had really become interested in sort of community level organizations, community foundations. United Way is one of the programs we were running in Omaha was a community center in South Omaha, which is a heavily Hispanic neighborhood and lots of recent immigrants. It's a meatpacking district. And so I was working with in a center that would provide food support, entrepreneurial business training, parenting classes, GED, immigration legal support, all of that. And so it was, really I was like embedded in that community. And one of the things that I appreciated, we were funded at that time by United Way for that center, the Omaha United Way. And they were working on a project to really connect the different human services nonprofits through a shared data system so that we could understand if someone came into our pantry and they grabbed food and then they also needed, let's say, parenting classes, we could almost document that, record that, and share that with their consent with other providers in the community. So if we couldn't provide a service, we could refer more seamlessly, more efficiently across the sector. For years and years, and it still is this way, nonprofits are notoriously kind of stuck in in a silo. Some of those shared, you think of the medical system, you have this shared medical record which travels with you regardless of the provider, the specialty. Well, nonprofits aren't that much different in human services. We have different specialties, different services, but that communication piece between programs is often a black hole, and that's not the fault of the nonprofits. That's really just how the system is designed, and there hasn't been a great solution to solve for that.
Well,
So United Way was working on
that
that
was
problem.
that was pretty forward thinking for you, Omaha, to do that.
Yeah.
Was this their idea? Did someone come along and say, I wanted to do this, or how did that come about?
Yeah, I'm not sure because that was something United Way was leading, and it was sort of out of my scope at the time. But it caught. I've always been someone who really is interested in that 30,000 foot view and how things get connected. And so I knew at that point, like I wasn't going to stay in direct client work and direct services for the rest of my career, and was feeling a little bit of burnout from that work, to be frank. And so I started looking at United Way and community foundations, those kind of orgs, and we at that time were very outdoorsy kind of people. We love biking and skiing and all that, and so we thought, a lot of people in Omaha end up moving to Denver's great outdoor scene, and we wanted to move west. We love the mountains, and so we had sort of circled a geography that wasn't too far away from the Midwest. So we weren't interested in going all the way to the West Coast, but we thought, somewhere between like Salt Lake and Denver would be an interesting place to just keep an eye on jobs. And I was looking at United Way jobs, and this Pocatello job opened up, and I actually had never heard of Pocatello. I had never been to Idaho in my life,
So you've
and
never seen Napoleon Dynamite, Kevin?
I had seen that, and I think that was I learned that was Preston, Idaho, which was not too far from Pocatello, Southeast Idaho. And yeah, I'd seen that. That's all I knew of Idaho, right? I thought if that's all you know of Idaho, you're kind of like, wow, what is this place? And
My daughters were younger when that film first was released, and I remember watching it going, "This is the craziest damn thing I've ever seen in my life." I mean, but yet it was one of those cult kind of offbeat comedies that
yeah,
just hit a nerve and just went nuts, is what it did.
yeah, it's a cult classic for sure. And so I applied for the job, and the email for an interview came back. It hit my spam folder, and at the time I was sort of like putting a lot out there, so I wasn't super, paying attention to it, and sat in my spam folder. I didn't notice for 2 or 3 weeks. They finally called me and said, "Are you still interested?" I said, "Oh my gosh, yeah, what? I never heard from you." I looked, there it was in the spam folder for the CEO position, and one thing led to the next. Interviewed, Zoom, phone, or whatever it was, and this is pre-pandemic, so I guess it was like GoToMeeting, whatever that system was, and finally got it to the stage where they flew me out for a final interview, and my wife, was like, "Where is this place? Where are you taking us?" So she came out for the interview too, so she could get eyes on it,
So,
and
so when they flew you out, did I know there is an airport in Pocatello, not very much of one. Did you go there or go to Idaho Falls?
We went straight into Pocatello, so flew to Salt Lake, and then there's it's like a 27-minute flight from Salt Lake to Pocatello.
Boom.
Was a beautiful bluebird winter day. It was like middle of December. So it had just snowed. There was like sparkly white snow on the peaks. It's a beautiful valley, the Portneuf Valley in Pocatello. It's a little college town, of course, and kind of a sleepy college town, but it was, a place that immediately we felt, okay, we could do this. This is smaller than a place that we've ever lived, but we didn't necessarily think it would be like a forever place, and that turned out to be correct. It wasn't, but it was a place where we could see ourselves. We had young kids, only two kids at the time. Our third would be born there in Pocatello a couple of years later, and it was just it was such a welcoming community. To be the CEO of a local United Way is such a important and relied upon position in that community. It really was a
You
sort
were
of a
very visible.
what's that?
You were very visible.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was. I mean, all of a sudden,
Tell me about that.
you're asked to be
Yeah.
in the Rotary clubs on different mayoral forces. You just have to be part of that community. It's like being, somewhat like the president of the university in a way. Like you have to be at all these functions. It was just a very public position, which took some getting used to for me because I wasn't necessarily looking for that. But growing into that was probably one of the biggest leadership development pieces that I went through.
Well, so and you felt welcomed into the community pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit of a culture shock and at first because it's coming from the Midwest, coming from bigger cities, growing up in Minneapolis, and Omaha is, a little bit bigger than Boise, but kind of a mid-sized big city now. And you go to a college town where it's a population of less than 60,000, maybe the whole metro area is like 95, 100,000. And it's very rural. Moving to Idaho, there's the whole rancher kind of mentality. There's the pull yourself up by your bootstrap, rugged individualism, all these things. Like it's a different sense of community and a different sense of history, and that took some getting used to. Certainly, there's religious differences in this part of the country. There's cultural and political differences. So there was a lot to get used to. And then, I think I knew I was in a different place when I took the driver's test because Idaho makes you retake the driver's test, and you have to take the written version, not get in a car and drive. But they have all these questions about like what happens if you hit cattle on open rangeland and who's responsible for it. And these are questions that I never had ever had to think about. I'd grown up in Minneapolis.
And when I had some friends out here. I moved out from Western New York in 2006, and I love going up the mountains as you do, and the hiking and all the other things that go with it. I had a friend come out from the east, and we're driving up to catch him, just at Sun Valley, and we see these signs that say open range, and Paul would say, "What does that mean?" I said, "That means, Paul, that if you hit the steer, you're responsible to pay the rancher, and they're not cheap, and they do a lot of damage to your car." Oh, 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 he said.
Yeah, it could be a 4 or 5 digit bill, right? So
Big time. If you should be so unlucky as to hit his prize bull, you're in big trouble there. um, so yeah, that took some getting used to, but you felt welcome there, and so now you're in Boise.
Mhm, mhm.
You're not at a United Way. You're not at a particular nonprofit. You're running a statewide association. I mean, it's called the center, but it's an association. All right, which you've got membership to deal with. Your revenue model is different. Um, there is, I guess, it's primarily funded through dues, correct? It's what.
That's a big piece of it, not the majority of it, but it's a big piece
So
for
what?
sure.
Where does the other part of the revenue come from?
So it's a pretty even split between, you can think of it like quarters or thirds, but membership dues, there's a lot of fee for service. So registration, when people sign up for our trainings, conferences, events, all of those things. Private or mostly private philanthropy as well, foundations, corporate sponsorship, some of that funds, and then we have a few individual donors as well. So it's in some ways I mean, we have the traditional nonprofit fundraising model, of course, but we also have a lot of earned and sort of market driven revenue through our membership program and through our courses, what the value basically that we're providing back to the nonprofit sector. And that all kind of fuels our revenue engine. And so it's a pretty diverse set of revenue. We, are lucky in that way because we're not reliant on just one source like many other nonprofits where maybe it's just one big government grant or it's one big funder or just individual funders at the whims of, economic ups and downs.
Well, that makes for a healthy mix: fee for service, membership dues, philanthropy. That makes for a healthy mix.
Yeah, it's been nice in that way. It's a pretty, very stable organization, and we saw that through, as I took over 3 years ago, more as we're, right, I guess at that point we're kind of halfway through COVID. We're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. There's uncertainty economically, inflation, all of that, but we've been able to kind of maintain steady and financially have a really good outlook.
Now, for those who are not familiar with Idaho, most, and I say most, I'd say all, but maybe 10% of the nonprofits that are registered and active in the state are pretty small in terms of annual budget. Um,
Yeah.
when you're dealing with organizations that are, um, how do I put this? They may struggle, but they're worthy. Is
Mhm.
that, is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, you're spot on, especially with the revenue side. So that's a good place to start. So if you look at our data in Idaho, and this is actually pretty similar in many states in terms of the percentage of nonprofits that are in that sort of small category. And so about 88 to 90% of nonprofits in Idaho have a budget less than $2 million annually. So when we think about some of our largest nonprofits in our state, which is true of other states as well, are healthcare and then educational institutions, the eds and the meds, as we say. And so we have some
What did
they're kind of
the what did you say?
the eds and the meds.
The ends and the men.
Ed,
The
the
eds and
eds and the meds.
well, you know what that reminds me of? I heard once that in Britain, of course, they have different names for everything, but there's it's something I forgot what the column is called, uh, but they refer to it as hatch, match, and dispatch. Get what they're saying? Births, marriages, deaths, hatch,
Yeah.
match, dispatch. So you did the eds and the meds.
Meds, yeah. So those are the largest nonprofits in most states because of the scale size, and healthcare more and more is run by charitable nonprofits. Although it's in all nonprofits, this is true not only of educational and healthcare, but all nonprofits are businesses. We like to say nonprofit is a tax status and not a business plan, and it's important to remind the public that essentially this is a collection, 90% of nonprofits being under $2 million in annual revenue. This is no different than the small business sector across our state.
Let me
Nonprofits.
let me stop. Let's go back a little bit. I love what you said when you said nonprofit status. Nonprofit is a status, not a business plan. Now, I've been working with nonprofits for well over 35 years, and I guess more than half of well, about half of my career was with the eds. All right, but I've also worked a lot of smaller organizations. Let's address this whole idea because I know you've seen it. I've seen it where the organizations themselves don't seem to have a very good understanding that they are running a business. You know, I'm sure you run into that. How do I mean? Are you trying to deal with that in some way, or are you just kind of like gloss over it, or I mean, what is your approach to, shall we say, enlightening these people?
Yeah, I think, sometimes, especially in smaller nonprofits, the boards, they're really not thinking in terms of long-term financial planning and, building in some net income in their budget, thinking that they need to have a zero-based budget. Sometimes it's just misconceptions about what the IRS expects. But, we always say the only difference between nonprofits and for-profits is nonprofits don't have shareholders where profits go back to those shareholders. Profits in nonprofits legally need to go back into the mission. So that could be starting a new program. It could be saving for a rainy day fund. It could be a new building and plugging into your capital needs, maintenance, hiring new staff. It doesn't really matter what it goes back to as long as it's mission oriented. And nonprofits should have those years and hopefully good years where that net income provides some flexibility and some long-term planning. And so I think it's some of that is just a mindset shift and really thinking in terms of some of those business principles. Some of it is just the scarcity of kind of that hamster wheel of, hey, we need to make it to the end of the year. We're not sure where that last bit of funding is going to come from. And then they're just barely scraping by. Maybe they barely hit that budget goal and move on. So it's tough. And funding cycles in the sector are notoriously 1 year cycles, which doesn't help from that perspective. There's a lot of education that we do with funders, and if I could wave a magic wand, I would say, could we find foundations and funders who are willing to invest in 3 year cycles? One of our really important funders does this. This is the MJ Murdoch Charitable Trust in Vancouver, Washington. They fund nonprofits all over the Pacific Northwest. They're a fantastic thought partner. They're a fantastic investor in states and in nonprofits, and they have 3 year funding cycles. And one of their signature grant programs actually provides fairly large six-figure type grants over a 3 year period. And what they do is they taper. So you have 100% investment. And then let's say you're investing in a new position or a new program. That first year, it's that full amount. Then it's like, 60, 70%. And then it's 40% and it kind of tapers off. So it gives you a runway as a nonprofit to build that funding into your operation plan, because that's often where it's hardest for nonprofits is there's not like the for-profit world, we can go to investors and say, hey, and I need some capital, invest in the capital, invest in this, and then there's going to be a return on that, and that provides that runway. In nonprofits, it's like, where do I get that working capital, right? Especially for not small nonprofits where you've got three, four staff, five staff, which is often the kind of median staff size for nonprofits in states like Idaho. So it's just so difficult right now to get that runway and to get that accelerant that nonprofits need to get to the next level. And I don't think that's necessarily somewhat of a systemic issue. It's somewhat of how do we rethink that both from a nonprofit leadership perspective and also as a funder, how do we do that differently?
Well, Murdoch also, one thing that I like about them, and they're not alone in this, but there's certainly one that does this. They provide capacity grants to a nonprofit to help them develop that financial capacity, usually through the acquisition of a full-time fund development staff
Mhm.
and enough money to do some planning or do some initial kind of things. Um, I've I've seen those. I don't want to be cynical, but I've seen a lot of nonprofits misuse those by simply hiring a short-term grant writer or somebody else, which really doesn't change the nature of the fund development program or build the capacity of it. But it can do that. And I've
Mhm.
had nonprofits approach me and I say I point them. There's another foundation in the East that does that. And I say, here, there you can research, and there are a couple that will do this, so you can get that, as you said, runway to get started. Um, they are so. Let's pull it in a little bit. Um, where do you see your particular organization going in the next 2 years? Yeah,
Yeah, well,
where would you like it to go? Let me change that question. Where would you like it to go?
yeah. Well, I think it starts with what the needs of the sector are. We are heavily attuned to our 850 nonprofit members across the state. Again, those are members, everything from the largest health systems, 501(c)(3) health systems, all the way down to all volunteer members that operate in very rural communities. So it's a diverse set of folks. But every year we put out a capacity building needs assessment survey, and overwhelmingly what we're seeing is there's a need for financial support and funding. That is the top need, and that's not surprising. Again, for the reasons we've just discussed, that need for investment. Currently, the majority of nonprofits cannot meet the full demand on the public's demand for their services. So we think about the waiting lists that we have for housing, for childcare. I was just on the phone with a nonprofit childcare provider from our Panhandle region of North Idaho, and they have a waiting list of 250 people. This is not a metro urban area. This is, largely a resort area, and there's a
When you
waiting list of two
when you say 250, you mean parents or children or
families, yeah, children, a waiting list of 250 children at this particular program that needs spots in that childcare. And so it's a real
is in
issue where,
and this is in a small community.
yeah, this is in a resort town community. We're talking like less than 100,000 people. So this is not uncommon. That by far, I really do believe nonprofits when they say, hey, we need funding to meet the full demand for our services. And that's true of the arts. I mean, we live in Boise here, which is one of the fastest growing cities in the country. And our local theater is going to be having our Performance Arts Center, which is on the campus of Boise State University. They're going to be doing a capital campaign. They're going to be renovating, adding seats, adding services, amenities. Like we are maxed out. I was recently at a production that they put on, and like they don't have enough bathrooms for the full sold out crowd. You have to wait
Oops,
in line. Yeah, so it's
oops.
everything from butts and seats and cultural stuff to housing and childcare and those really meat and potato issues that make communities thrive. So financial resources, number one, how do we pair our work with funders? How do we educate funders? That's a huge part of where we're going. How do we work with funders? How do we pair the services we provide with funding opportunities that go hand in hand? Secondly, continuing to develop people. I think that's the second thing that came back on our survey is there isn't really a career pathway model. It's not like the technical trades where you become a welder, you go through this really specific career training path, or to become an accountant. Nonprofit work largely is knowledge-based work, but it's also people-based work. It's certainly we do have licensed social workers in the sector and people that work on case management, but to be able to put these pieces together, you need people who think innovatively, creatively. It's not all that different than any other business skill set. But we have MBAs for the for-profits. We don't have a lot of the equivalent in the nonprofit sector. Sometimes MPAs, Master of Public Administration. That's often government type work.
That's a
Uh,
different model altogether. That's not run.
yeah,
You're essentially asking people to run a private business, a small business at that.
yeah, yeah,
I mean,
exactly. And
I
be
wonder,
community leaders
I
at the
wonder
same.
if there aren't some uh, MBA programs that would be suitable. For
Yeah. Yeah, there needs to be in one of the differences between, let's say, a small business that's for profit. Let's say you run a local auto repair shop. You can just do that as best you can and have the best service and the best parts and the best people, and that's all you need to worry about. But when you're running a small business of the same size that's a nonprofit, now as a leader, you're expected to be above just running your business, and you've got to connect the pieces to the wider community. You've got to work with your partners in the housing sector, within the childcare sector. You've got to have community leadership skills. It's a whole different skill set to bring those things together, and to run that business effectively, it takes community leadership skills. And that's where I think there's a lot of opportunity to continue to develop people, to build pipelines. We're really invested in that work. We have some leadership development programs that are fairly new. One's 3 years old and one is just starting this August. And then finally, collective impact models. And we see this especially around these really sticky, tough issues like housing. No single nonprofit is going to solve homelessness. We need all of these groups, and we see this in the Treasure Valley, which is the Boise area, happening through collective impact models where one nonprofit might do eviction prevention and have funding for that. Another one does family homelessness support. Another one does domestic violence support. Another one is emergency shelter. One has just the intake, like the emergency, like when someone is needing a home or a place to stay, they call that and it gets triaged out to the right partner. And so these kind of models where you can raise money together, you can share strategy, kind of share a collective vision across a whole community. That's what it's going to take to solve some of these really tough problems. And we're seeing that in housing, childcare, education to some degree. So there's really positive signs there.
what do you see? Let's talk about. You mentioned about cooperation between organizations several times, and you've been in several settings where you've had the opportunity to see that or the lack of it. Where do you think we stand here in Boise in terms of the ability for nonprofits to get beyond the territorialism that's out there and work together toward a common goal? Where do you see that?
Yeah, it's getting better all the time in that respect. We one of the questions we ask in our annual survey is how do you collaborate with among nonprofits? How do you collaborate with the business sector? And how do you collaborate with government? And not surprisingly, people feel a high sense of collaboration and trust among nonprofit to nonprofit. There are some exceptions, of course, where that doesn't happen very well, but I think in general, there's a realization that no single nonprofit can fulfill that sticky need like homelessness themselves, and that they need their partners, and there's a lot of goodwill there to build upon. But there's more we can do, and I think the next step in that is really realizing that I believe we can raise more money collectively than we can individually as well, because donors want to see that return on investment. They want to see these intractable, tough problems getting solved, right? They want to see educational outcomes increasing. They want to see children being more ready for kindergarten when they enter. They want to see homelessness decreasing, right? When they make investments across a collective impact model, the hard part is how do we decide where that funding goes, because we all have our own organizations, and that's where that shared leadership, if it's done well, can be really great, but it also can cause some problems, and that's a tough ask for our sector.
Let me be the next say for a minute, and I know you've heard this. I'm just going to speak what I think others have say. It's something you've heard, I'm sure. Well, these nonprofits, they never cooperate, and they're doubling, tripling, quadrupling over each other, duplicating services. Is such a wasteful whole enterprise. Now, I'm sure you've heard that. How do you, first of all, do you see that much? But beyond that, how do you deal with that criticism?
Yeah, I mean, I fundamentally believe nonprofits want to collaborate, often do collaborate and do it well. Are there duplication of services in some cases? Yes, I think that's we're going to probably, because of the way the market is, see a need to consolidate a little bit, and that may happen through mergers and acquisitions. That may happen through these collective impact models. I mean, we hear all the time, we get phone calls on our nonprofit helpline about how difficult the funding environment is right now, how competitive it is, and how people feel like they're just not going to make it. And I've actually had a number of organizations who are in the same space start to come together and merge or find programs that they can
Really?
share
So,
together.
so you've actually seen movement in that
Yeah,
direction.
yeah, absolutely. And that is such a positive sign. And I think I'm speaking for my generation of leadership. I think we having kind of come of age in the Great Recession, and there was a lot of economic uncertainty. Like my career started in 2008 when I graduated college. I happened to be in Uganda, so I was like really insulated from the Great Recession. But I had my best friend lost his job at a TV studio as a producer, within months of graduating. I had people in the financial institutions who didn't have work for months and months. And I remember coming back from Uganda, and there was still a really difficult labor market, and I was applying for all these nonprofit type jobs in Washington, D.C. And I probably put out 75 or 100 applications and would get like one call back. So we're in some ways like really formed by that. And I think that it's not that we have a scarcity mindset, but it's that understanding that there's more that we can do together. There's economic uncertainty always, even when the economy is good, there's maybe a dark cloud around the corner. And how do we prepare for that? How do we leverage the talent around us in the community? And it's really encouraging that I've seen that. And I think from our generation of leaders for sure. And that's not to say the older generation isn't doing that. There's plenty of great examples of that. And some of that is just getting boards to switch their mindset. I think it's healthy to have boards, with term limits that have fresh turnover, that have, younger folks on the board. It's not the same board member that's been there for 30 years. Because board members can
Oh,
get territorial.
you mean those boards that are fossils? I've met a few of
Yeah.
those.
Yeah, and they get territorial, right? And so they've been involved in the founding of the organization, and they're not seeing the full landscape either, often as much as some of the staff and executive director, executive leadership is. And so I'm hopeful about that. I'm actually very hopeful about the future of the sector and what that collaboration and collective work can really look like.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, and I could ask some more questions. But so let me give you the floor for a minute. Is there something we haven't spoken about that you'd like to talk about, or you'd like to tell us, or whatever?
Yeah, I think in many states, we often say Idaho runs on nonprofits. That's probably true in Montana. That's probably true in Illinois. It's probably true all over the country. Your communities thrive because nonprofits are there, and if nonprofits are thriving, there's a much better chance that your community is going to thrive. So
Well,
our big
Kevin, there is research there that demonstrates that the communities with the healthiest business communities are those with a strong philanthropic community as well. I mean, the two support each other.
Absolutely. That healthy ecosystem. And, I saw that when I worked in Omaha for sure. We had the Warren Buffetts and the different foundations that were spun off of some of that wealth. And yeah, you're absolutely right there. So I think just,
It's not just the whales.
yeah, it's not just the whales. It's the healthy corporate, it's the middle management folks in your bigger employers or your small businesses who are investing into those nonprofits. I think one of our research points is the average household gives about 1.8% of their after-tax disposable income to charitable causes. And so if a household has $100,000, that's about $1,800 that they're giving to charitable causes. And I'm not in a scarcity mindset. I do believe there's enough money in the richest country on earth to solve these problems if we have the
Kevin,
will.
we should have a discussion. There is more than enough money. Let me
Yeah.
tell you, there is so much money that's literally sitting out there. We can discuss that later. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
there. It's there. And let me just say one thing. You mentioned about middle management corporate. In my experience, and I've worked all over the country, I worked for Ketchum for a while, as you know, the single most generous people and I'm talking individuals here, in any community were business owners, owners, not people on a corporate salary or a handful of whales. In fact, I think a whale actually skews the results and can kind of relieve other people of their sense of responsibility. Oh, well, Warren will do that. He'll pick up the bill, you know, and he often will. Okay. But that's what and the reason why is that these small businesses or the business owners, and I'm not talking about bankers, they don't own the bank. I'm talking about, dry goods, hardware, all these other kinds of businesses, professional associations, they feel a commitment to the community because the community has provided them their living, you see. So they have this sense that they are a part of the community. And I think, and I would just say this to you, since there aren't a lot of big corporate interest in Idaho, a lot of it is small business. I think there's a real opportunity if it's approached the right way. Despite what some people would say, oh, this is the Marlboro man, people live or die on their own efforts and blah, 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 blah. Well, there's some of that. But we're all still Americans and we still subscribe to that sense of being together as a community. And I've sensed that here in Idaho since I've.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think you're spot on, and getting those folks, especially at those moments where they transfer ownership of their business or pass it on, like those are moments where there's tax implications and there's great incentives to set up a fund at a community foundation or give, part of an estate. So yeah, you're absolutely right. That is
Can I give you a little story about that?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I won't name names to protect the guilty, but notice how I said that, protect the guilty. You weren't here, but in the just before the financial collapse in 0809, we had several years of serious real estate appreciation, really big gains, and it was coupled with a lot of development people moving in. So I was involved with a nonprofit that was doing a project, and they had some very good support, but they'd not done a good job at educating some of their investors, their donors. That's what I call donors, investors, and neither were the investors very sophisticated. So they were selling zero basis property and then giving the proceeds to the nonprofit. When I discovered that, Kevin, how quickly could I scream on the rooftops, stop, 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 stop? Because these are the very same people, the donors, who would be wailing when the tax man showed up at their door. What? Government? Because they sold zero basis, literally zero basis farmland for an incredible number. Okay. And then gave it all, which was wonderful. But and see, this goes back to a lack of sophistication on the nonprofit's part because they were loath to handle the real estate. Oh, don't give us the real estate, sell it and give us the proceeds. Oh my God, stop. Do you see a need to educate people in that regard here?
Well, yeah, for sure on the more advanced type of giving, like planned giving, giving of real estate, for example,
Tangible assets, any tangible asset.
Yeah. I mean, that's an area of such need and growth around education. There's some good folks out there doing work to try to do that, but there's a long way to go still. And I count myself in that category too. There's a lot to learn in that space. So it's something that's been untapped. There's opportunity there, and it takes I think us working together as a sector to learn and educate ourselves about those types of opportunities.
Well, let's just say it's not nearly as scary as people think it is. It's just a matter of doing it the right way.
Well, at least we're past the crypto trend. I think that was the currency trend for a year or two was kind of like, should nonprofits be prepared to take that? What are the policies around that? And that's kind of come and gone. So at least we don't have to deal with that right now.
Well, you know what your buddy Warren says about crypto. He called it rat poison.
Sounds like Nick Saban from the Alabama football team. he calls any praise rat poison.
Well, Kevin, I want to thank you very, very much. I think we'll do this again. Next time, I want to get into more of sort of what you're going to be doing in the next 5 years. We're going to stretch it out a little bit next time. But I would do. Oh, the also thing, you got to write a book, Kevin. You're the right age. You got enough stuff going on. Now's the time to write a book. I'm going to encourage you to do that as well, because that's when you begin to really have an impact with other people.
Mm.
You can, when you and you've got enough experience under your belt, you've seen some things, you're willing to continue to learn, and then you have a corpus of wisdom to begin to offer other people. And so that's I want to encourage you to do that. And if you need contacts with a publisher or publicist, call me. I can put you in touch. All right.
That's good. Yeah, I love it.
Thank,
Another thing to add to the list.
of course. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on. This was fun.
This has been delightful, everyone. Thank you for taking your time to come and listen to us today. And I'm sure that Kevin will come back and visit us. I'll twist his arm a little bit. And so next time, another change maker and leader in the philanthropic and nonprofit space. Thank you for your time.